"100 years ago, over 300 big houses were destroyed across Ireland. This film will look at the Big Houses of Longford, telling their story particularly during the revolutionary period 1913 to 1923. What do we know about the big houses? We are told the landlords were greedy, cruel and oppressive towards their tenantry. We are told the people who lived in them were different from the rest of the people, not Irish and of a different religion. We know they symbolise British rule and all the negative connotations of empire, the very people who benefited from the confiscations and plantations of the 16th and 17th centuries. We know a lot about the big houses. Or do we? To fully understand the revolutionary period, it's crucial to understand the 50 years leading up to 1913. For centuries, Ireland received waves of colonial invaders. From the Vikings to the Normans through to the plantation era, land was passing out of the native Irish landed families to the new settlers and a new ruling elite. By the end of the Williamite Wars in the late 17th century, Ireland had a system of landed estates and tenant farmers. 95% of the land was in the ownership of Protestant landlords, with very few Catholic landlords remaining. This piece of social engineering was reinforced by the penal laws of the 18th century, which compounded the social, economic and religious divide. This state of affairs continued until the end of the 19th century, when Ireland embarked on a social revolution.
In the latter part of the 19th century, you have the emergence of the Home Rule movement, which is a successful marriage, if you like, of the land agitation with the campaign for Home Rule for Ireland. And as part of that, you have leaders of the national movement presenting the landlord class as an alien class who have benefited from British conquest and confiscation of land in previous centuries.
They are regarded and portrayed as oppressors and colonisers, and their big houses become symbols of colonialism in Ireland. And of course, all of that links back to what those on platforms are calling hundreds of years of oppression. All of this historical baggage therefore is carried forward to the land war era of the late 1870s, and those on platforms who want to excoriate landlords can point to the fact that they have been subjected to hundreds of years of subjugation by the usurpers and colonisers.
I mean, a great many of the big houses, such as Castle Forbes, for instance, belonged to a Catholic family. The Catholic gentry, whom you even could, sometimes people refer to as the Catholic ascendancy, were just as much targets of the land agitation as Protestants.
The landlord classes were not without their own critics. In the early 19th century, Maria Edgeworth's writings about the fecklessness and debauchery of the landed classes were so powerful that they planted a view of them in the popular imagination of the people.
Maria Edgeworth is, of course, now very famous as one of the first novelists of the British Isles, as someone who wrote about the responsibilities and the duties of the landlord class in Ireland, and how neglect of those duties, as in absenteeism or failing to take sufficient care for the tenants, would be a dangerous path for landlords to follow. Her writing highlights the fact that landlord families needed to become part of the locality, even if they were outsiders to start with, even if they were perceived still as outsiders after several generations of residence. They needed to be caring of their estates and their tenants and their welfare. The Edgeworth family were quite dutiful and responsible and took care of their tenants.
By the 1870s, the British government, in order to pacify Irish demands for land reform and self-determination, passed a series of land acts to reform the land administration of Ireland, thus attempting to remove the raison d'etre of the Irish complaints and to quell the increasing number of violent incidences that were taking place.
You know, I felt terribly guilty when I learnt some of these facts when I was little about the Cromwellian connection and things. And of course my grandmother would never have it that it had been given to them by Cromwell.
To placate the Irish, the British government had to make each successive Land Act more generous than the last.
Wyndham Land Act, which takes its name from George Wyndham, who was the Chief Secretary for Ireland at the time. Under the Act itself, landlords are guaranteed much higher prices for their estates that might have been available under the previous Land Acts passed between 1881 and the 1890s.
The Acts always ensured that the landlords were not out of pocket, and the landless Irish tenants were turned into owner-occupiers in the hope that they would maintain the status quo.
They were guaranteed a 12% bonus on the sale of their estates. So no matter how indebted a landlord was, he was guaranteed to get something out of what effectively was a bailout from the British government that is financed largely by the British taxpayer. But there are still considerable numbers who continue to live in their houses such as Carriglass and even Castle Forbes, and supplementing now what is essentially an income from investment with farming. And that means they have retained these large chunks of untended land in Ireland.
Those families who got through on the whole had what they called dry money, which was money in the bank. They had money elsewhere. The ones who did not survive were the ones who did not have dry money because the tenants got their own land and the big house was back on its domain. They had to try and make the domain a viable farm, which was often difficult because it was the worst land because so much of it was pleasure grounds. Naturally, there was a big drop in income.
These acts diminished the power of the landed class. However, the big houses still held powerful economic control over rural Ireland. People had few options.
The big house was looked upon as a great source of employment for the locals. Wages were low, but they were jolly glad to have a job because there weren't no jobs around. And so, obviously, all those big houses, you couldn't run them anyway without quite a large staff because there were so few modern conveniences.
I'd say there could be maybe 6, 7, I believe. And then there was a lot of course, there was gardeners there and farm hands and people looking after horses. That was a mansion of it there. Down at the back of the dwelling house, there was a living accommodation, and then there was a place called the saddle room. But man used to look after the saddles for the horses and this and that. My father and Tom Black and them people, they got a shilling a day. That's weird, because one man, if it's all right to say it, there was a Tom Black man, he told me, he was a lovely old man, he said he had to, for 5 years he had to save up to buy a pair of boots. It would have been a great job. Like it was constant work.
The kitchen at Whitehill, and indeed all the back areas, were primitive in the extreme, and I do not know how the staff ever managed without even running water. The servants would bring in a hip bath every morning and place it on an oilcloth to catch the splashes and spills. These baths only required 1 can of hot water to be brought up from the kitchen. Of course, all this needed considerable labour. There was the emptying too, but fortunately in those days there was plenty of hands around the kitchen to do the hard work.
a boom to the parish league, you know. A great help, like. As I said, there was no employment, only gym at that time. Yeah. Like, I know the wages were small, but that people were glad to have it.
The big house and the tenant farms or the estate employed a lot of people. I mean, it might look as though it wasn't that many, but that would keep their families going. And their families nearly always had some sort of accommodation on the land, with the house or in the yards or in that sort of thing. And it was very much a sort of entity. I think the big house was like a little village, really.
Well, I lived in Castleforbes for almost 18 years. And my father was butler house steward at Castleforbes for almost 4 decades. I got a chance to work at various jobs within the castle there. My mother worked there as well. She helped in the kitchen. My sister worked there. She was a housemaid. It was a good working relationship and good communication between the gentry and the staff. My father, he was the butler house steward, so he would have looked after the post for the Earl when he wasn't there, breakfast for the gentry, made sure that everything was on the day-to-day running it with the drinks and the food. I would have been like working in the glass houses there in the vegetable garden there, watering tomatoes, picking the fruit. The glass houses years ago used to grow carnations there, and these were used to decorate the flowers in the house in Castleforbes.
Where my Kelly lived, that was them 6 houses was Foxhall property. The Foxes owned it. And down there, maybe it's not interested, but down there was an Ed Hanning in the first house next to it. He was a baker. And in the next house next to the village, second house, my Kelly, that was the gardener. And he lived with his sister. And there's a third house next to the village, there were 2 sisters, Nanny and Mary Regan. They were dressmakers. And where I was born in the 4th house was a Ned Harrington. He was a cobbler. So the next house, the 5th house then, was our family. And they had no trade, only just a labouring class one. And the 6th house then, there were boys, they were farriers or blacksmiths. So, yeah.
The men in the yard, Joe Condren, who ran the Herefords, and Peter Conroy, who was the horse expert, Jimmy Mulryan, who drove the tractor, who was rather young. My sister and I thought was rather glamorous, and sometimes he'd let us sit on the tractor and even drive it occasionally.
I think the relationship was very good between upstairs and downstairs. One of my memories of the servants' hall that we had was around 6 o'clock. I would hear the gentle hum of the rosary being recited and led by the cook.
We always had to be Miss Annabel and Miss Leslie and Master Michael. I remember once Jimmy called me Annabel, and I remember sternly saying to him at the age of about 9, you know, "It's Miss Annabel to you," which is a dreadful memory really, but it's just the way it was.
On the whole, we were told never to discuss either politics or religion. That would be reported, what one had said, and then it would be taken out of context. And we certainly wouldn't talk about politics or religion, obviously, in front of the servants.
When Maria Edgeworth's novels appeared in the early 19th century, she created in the public's mind the view that all landlords were dissipated and morally corrupt. In reality, some were good and some were bad. A symbiotic relationship between landlord and employee seems to have existed in many cases, even if the landlord imposed the strict social mores of the day in an avuncular way.
It was sort of 2 long halls. The lads slept in one half, and then there was a little bit where the dragon slept in the middle to make sure there was no hanky-panky, and then the maid slept in the other. She was known to be a dragon and kept control. She was probably the senior housemaid or the housekeeper or something like that. She would have probably been a single lady but with a married title. She would have probably called Mrs. somebody, you know, and she would have been controlling all the staff.
Oh, most of them I just loved, and we had the most darling, well, she was jolly fierce, but anyway, cook housekeeper called Katie McGlynn, and her father had been the coach driver. Katie came to work in the house probably, I think, at about 14, and then she got tangled up with what my grandmother called a bounder, a Mr. Gray, don't know where he came from. Anyway, the next thing, of course, she was expecting a child, and so my grandmother forced him to marry her, poor Katie. I don't know how old she was, but still in her mid-teens. And then they were sent off to England. But sadly, the baby died, and he left, of course. So she came back to Ireland, and as far as I know, she never left Whitehill again until she retired. So she ruled everything with a rod of iron. But she was wonderful. The house couldn't have survived without her, really. But this Katie was an absolute dragon if you were late for lunch or something. I mean, even my father, who was a British Army officer, turned up on time and did what Katie told him.
This way of life continued well into the 20th century, despite the fact that the British government's Land Acts had transferred approximately 80% of the land from the big houses to the tenants before 1914. The next 10 years, known in Ireland as the revolutionary period, were to have far-reaching consequences for the big house and its way of life. On the 4th of August 1914, Britain declared war on Germany. Following this announcement, there was a wave of jingoism across Europe. Ireland was not exempt from this war fever.
Initially, there was this surge of support for the war effort, including from John Redmond, the leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party. And Redmond makes two very famous speeches in which he instructs the rank and file of the Irish National Volunteers to join the British Army.
Lord Granard, from Castle Forbes in Longford, commanded the 5th Battalion of the Royal Irish Regiment, known as the Pioneers. This unit included many men from Longford, and in the summer of 1915 was sent to fight in Gallipoli, one of the bloodiest campaigns of the Great War. Two major events in Ireland during World War I were to have far-reaching consequences. The first was the 1916 Easter Rising, which in itself did not change public opinion. It was the British reaction to it. The British placed the country under martial law, even though most of the rebellion took place in Dublin. The authorities executed 16 of the rebel leaders, the first 15 in a 10-day period soon after the uprising. And with 3,500 arrests and 1,600 prisoners held without trial, public fury was directed towards the British. This helped build support for Irish independence, with public opinion quickly turning in support of the rebellion. The conscription crisis of 1918 was the second event which demonstrated the seismic shift in Ireland's public opinion against British rule. This was a successful campaign in which, for the first time, women were mobilised to thwart British conscription. The campaign was successful, with the effect that no one from Ireland was ever drafted into the British Army. However, approximately 32,000 Irish men from what is now the Republic died whilst fighting in the British forces in the First World War.
In the May 1917 by-election, County Longford became one of the first counties in the country to experience a mobilisation of the new nationalist movement after the Easter Rising. Two candidates in the May 1917 South Longford by-election were Joseph McGuinness of Sinn Fein And this was a very bold move on the part of Sinn Fein, because McGuinness, of course, was then serving a sentence in Lewis Prison for his involvement in the 1916 Rising. And of course, McGuinness was selected as the candidate and of course used the famous slogan, put him in to get him out, with McGuinness depicted in prison uniform on the poster. When McGuinness won with the majority of only 37 votes, there was something happening in nationalist Ireland, that Home Rule no longer satisfied the aspirations of the nationalist community, and that there was a reframing of the whole question of Ireland's future away from the limited form of Home Rule within the UK towards full sovereign independence. So County Longford was at the vanguard of this new national movement which emerges after 1916.
Eleanor Thwaites, in her Newcastle memoir, illustrates that old loyalties remained, despite the fact that Ireland was gearing up to fight for her independence.
My uncle Alex, on one of his home leaves during the Great War, looked out of his window in the morning to see the gravel sweep in an awful mess in front of the house. He called one of the gardeners and asked what on earth had happened. After some persuasion, the man admitted that when they had come to work, they had found a neatly dug grave for Uncle Alex right in front of the house, and I tried to quickly fill it in so that he would not be worried.
The 1918 general election saw overwhelming support transfer to Sinn Fein and the Republican movement because it was anti-conscription. It was really the conscription crisis that galvanised the creation of physical resistance to British government of Ireland.
It was the youth and women who had come out strongly in support of Sinn Fein during the by-election. 18 months later, these individuals now have the vote. So this was obviously going to be a benefit to the Sinn Fein party. So Sinn Fein candidates in December 1918 were pledged to abstain from Westminster, and they promised that they would set up an Irish Parliament in Dublin if elected.
Currygran House in County Longford was the family home of the Wilson family. James Mackey Wilson was the oldest of 4 brothers and was very active in Unionist politics. His younger brother, Henry Hughes Wilson, was a career soldier, rising to the rank of Field Marshal and one of the most senior British Army staff officers of World War I.
James Mackey Wilson was an active Southern Unionist from the period of 1913 onwards, when it became apparent that the British government was committed to introducing a measure of home rule in some form. James Mackey Wilson was trying to warn of the danger that they saw for the disintegration of empire if Ireland was allowed to step outside the imperial model. And so James Mackey Wilson saw his world narrowing from being a country landlord gentleman in the 1890s with a healthy rent roll. By 1918, his world had completely disintegrated, really, and there was no place for him or his family in the new Ireland that was coming into being.
World War I had far-reaching consequences on society, with 6% of the adult male population dead, and 1 in 7 of the officers' class killed. The future of the big house to carry on down following generations looked very precarious. With the armistice in 1918, the map of Europe was redrawn, with previously small oppressed nations obtaining their independence. With the Irish population now demanding full separation from Britain, independence was declared at the first meeting of the Dáil on the 21st of January 1919. On that same day, by coincidence, there was an ambush in Tipperary that was the first incident in the War of Independence.
The struggle for independence, characterised by a war of reprisal and counter-reprisal between the IRA and the Crown forces, that again, the big house very much finds itself in the middle of this, because it gets caught up as a reprisal target, but also, once again, for agrarian reasons. Very often, locals see this as the opportunity to drive landlords away once and for all so that their lands will be redistributed amongst those who are left behind.
Sean Connolly and Sean McKeown, before 1920 or 1921, were unknown individuals outside of their own locality. It was only with the success of their attempts to disrupt British government in Bannalee and the surrounding area.
In 1910, McKeown was a member of the United Irish League, part of the Home Rule movement at that point. Over a period of time, he joins the Irish Volunteers. Later, he's sworn into the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and obviously by 1917, 1918 is a leading member of the Irish Volunteers and goes on to command the North Longford flying column during the War of Independence. So you see his journey from the politics of Home Rule to revolutionary nationalism.
Sean McKeown, leader of the flying column, who became a general in the Irish Army, had always remained a firm friend of the family all his life, and he himself had told me the famous story of my Uncle Harry, which he repeats in one of his letters. In it, he says, in his own words, Uncle Harry was driving along the road in his dog cart, dressed in his British Army uniform, when he encountered Sean drilling his squad of irregulars in a field and stopped to watch. After a bit, Uncle Harry said, "Sean, you're making a haines of that. Let me have them for a bit. You hold the horse." And so there was the spectacle of a British Army major drilling a squad of the IRA.
Finally, when the house was demolished, Whitehill, in 1961 or 60, I don't quite remember when, they found some arms in the roof that had probably belonged to the IRA. And in fact, my great-aunt had quite a lot of sympathy for them. And I believe that even Michael Collins had been to lunch there and things. I think they really wanted to help the IRA because they sympathised with their cause, despite how it might have endangered them. They felt really part of Ireland by then, and I don't think they feared any hatred from the local people, which has always been quite a source of, dare I say, pride.
Yeah, I'd say the Wilson sailors were considered Irish because they've been here so long. As far as I know. I know that Mrs. Welsh was buried in Dublin. Very, very decent people. So they were very decent during after the famine, and that the slaters here denied a lot of sheep to the poor people in Clonbrony.
The Wilson Slaters of Whitehill were so part of Ireland and Longford that there is said to be a ghost from the family that roams the ancestral lands, which has entered into local folklore.
Georgina Slater, she died in 1952, I think. There's always a little folklore about when she was dying, she asked for a bucket and a stick to be left in the vault with her so that she could attend to her calves. So I live around the Whitehill fields about a very dark, windy night. You could hear this tipping, and they would say that that's Georgina tipping the bucket, calling her calves. Believe it or not, they were folklore. They were very good landlords. They definitely were, yes.
At the time, there was a belief that the big houses contained rifles, shotguns and ammunition. So the IRA, which was desperately short of arms and ammunition, targeted the big houses to arm its members. Once armed, the policy was to systematically destroy Crown forces in the rural areas. Consequently, Many barracks of the Royal Irish Constabulary, the RIC, the police force of Ireland at the time, were attacked and destroyed, with the result that the RIC evacuated into larger urban areas. Thus, with no police force, many rural areas became ungovernable and lawless. With swathes of the countryside in this state, the Big House became much more vulnerable to attack. The British response was to draft recruits to build up the RIC. The Black and Tans, as the first of these recruits became known, and later the auxiliaries, were infamous for their brutality.
Every individual house burned has its own story to tell, and that story can often be very, very complicated. So what might seem to be simply a case, a house is burned as a counter-reprisal for Black and Tan or auxiliaries' atrocities in the locality, may very well hide ulterior motives.
The only house burned during the War of Independence in County Longford was Cllr House near Teshinny. Controversy surrounds this burning, with IRA leader Sean McKeown distancing himself from it in his witness statement.
Commandant Paddy Ryan of Ardagh came to Sean Connolly and myself with a special report concerning this matter, and that he had information that Cllr was about to be occupied. We thereupon authorised him to return immediately, remove the furniture from Cllr House and to burn it. I regret to say that the order was not obeyed as given.
Yet again, we see in the memoirs from Newcastle House a more complex picture forming of the inhabitants negotiating a path between self-preservation and divided loyalties.
The Troubles, as they were and are still called, do not affect Newcastle very seriously. The local people, whether living and working on the estate or not, but always friendly and kind. When the so-called rebels were taking shelter from the Black and Tans, or others in the woods, would be given or left usually by way of one of the gardeners. That's for the ladies to keep away from the woods. And later, after 2 or 3 days, another note giving the all clear would be found.
Field Marshal Henry Wilson believed Ireland should remain within the United Kingdom. He lobbied the British government to crack down on the Irish rebels who were waging a guerrilla war for independence. The Wilson brothers drew the attention of the Republican HQ in Dublin and their close neighbour, Sean McKeown.
He had been given the authorisation to burn Currygran during the War of Independence, but he held back, and he talked to James Mackey Wilson and asked him to use his influence with his brother to perhaps soften his stance with regard to the War of Independence. And in return, Currygran would be spared.
I called upon Wilson, brought him out, and showed him Duffy's and Connolly's on fire. I reminded him that the destruction had been carried out by forces acting under his brother's orders, and I insisted that he should write to Sir Henry and inform him that if the British burned another house in County Longford, Currygran would follow it up in flames. But not only that, but he, James Wilson, would very probably die with it. He said that the Field Marshal would pay no heed to such a request. Well, I replied, in that case, it will be too bad for Currygran and for you. I added that, should he attempt to leave Currygran, I would have him executed before he had reached Edgeworthstown or Longford. Before I left him, I said that if the battle was left to the military forces of both sides to fight it out, I would, in the name of the government of the Republic, guarantee protection of life and property to him and all others of his sort in the county, on condition that they remained strictly neutral.
By 1921, Henry and his brother had to leave Currygran. James Wilson, unable to access papers and valuables, was living impecuniously in Sussex. It was even unsafe for the Wilsons to book a ferry crossing to Dublin under their own name. Eleanor Thwaites, in her Newcastle memoir, tells us of the complexities of Irish life at this time. In this period, women's roles were changing at different levels of society, empowering women to fulfil activities previously unimaginable to them before the war.
And in the years 1917 to 1919, the head laundrymaid, a tall, well-built woman, was known to be captain in the Irish women's section of the IRA. Her two assistants used to salute her formally every morning with some words in Irish. And if I could find an excuse, used to enjoy being in or near the yard, partly to watch the ceremony, and partly I'm afraid to watch their blushes when they realised what I'd seen and heard. Actually, I dare say that without this little bit of protection, the house might easily have been burnt down during that period, as were many other houses.
Like many in the Irish diaspora, James Davis came back from America to fight for Ireland's freedom, then stayed to build a new Irish republic.
My connection with Foxhall in Legan is that my grandfather, James Davis, and his cousin, John Kelly, bought it in the early 1920s. My grandfather fought in the War of Independence, and I think it was after that he bought Foxhall and a number of acres of land that came with the big house.
As I say, Kelly and Davis, I think they bought it. And they were cattle dealers originally from County Roscommon. And they were two lovely men. I was in the house. I knew them well, very well. And I knew Davis's two girls, daughters, Rosie and Teresa. Yeah.
She used to tell me that herself and her sister Teresa played chasing on the top floor because her dad and uncle didn't use that at all, and the two children had full reign on the top floor. That top floor, she said, was originally used by the Fox family as the schoolrooms for the children of the Fox family. It was where the governess or the nursery teacher lived.
Oh, it was lovely looking inside. I remember the two big white doors in the front. I said there must be, I said there must be because there are 40 rooms there.
Leading academics debate why Longford had such a high level of violence in the War of Independence. Noted historian Marie Coleman lists many factors, including the high level of rural poverty, curtailment of immigration of young men due to World War I, and the strong leadership from Sean Connolly and Sean McKeown. After 2 years of war, a truce was declared in 1921 and a treaty was negotiated between the British government and the Irish separatists. The Anglo-Irish Treaty gave Ireland the status of a self-governing dominion, with the British monarch as head of state, and with Irish politicians swearing an oath of fidelity to the British Crown. Those opposed to the treaty saw the signing of it as a betrayal of their republican ideals and what they had fought for in the War of Independence, whilst those in favour of it saw it as a pragmatic stepping stone to full Irish independence. During the Civil War, there was a dramatic increase in the burnings of the big house across the country. This was largely due to the breakdown of law and order with the vacuum created by the withdrawal of Crown forces, the disbanding of the RIC and fighting between the two sides of the IRA.
Also, senators' houses are targeted as reprisals for the execution of anti-treatyites. So again, they just become that target of focus of Republicans for the Free State government's policy of execution. And that's why, for example, Castle Forbes in County Longford was probably attacked.
The attack on Castle Forbes was unsuccessful, partly due to the ineffective bombs used, but mainly due to the staff putting out the fires. Again, we see the complexities of Irish society coming into play.
In any given case, the burning of an individual house has to be thoroughly investigated to take a look for not just political or what might loosely be termed military reasons, but also social or agrarian reasons at the time of the burning itself, or sometimes very often hidden in the historical past.
In February 1923, around the same time as the attack on Castle Forbes, there was an attempt to burn Ardagh House, the seat of the Featherstone family, and also the inspiration for Oliver Goldsmith's She Stoops to Conquer. Reverend Sir George Featherstone, the sixth and last baronet, was an absentee, being a clergyman in Britain, but nevertheless, he was well regarded locally. The precise motive for the attack is unknown. The parish priest, Canon Guinan, led the locals in saving most of the building from being destroyed. However, in 1927, the house was given to the Sisters of Mercy, an order of nuns who established a college there. Many of the big houses, including Newcastle House, were saved by being taken over by religious orders. But not all of them.
Back years and years ago, it could have been a nunnery, but there was an old priest in Legan called Father Dowdall, and he objected to the nuns getting it because he said that if the nuns got it, he'd die with the hunger that no one is giving on. He was the man I was
In the Civil War period, 1922 to 23, you have a fairly dramatic increase in looting throughout the country. So, first of all, the houses themselves. Secondly, the domain. It means the pulling up and taking away of fairly exotic plants and sometimes even just simply fruit and vegetables, right? So looting becomes very much a part of the revolutionary experience.
Henry Wilson in the British Parliament denounced the treaty, calling it a sellout to the IRA murder gang. Within 1 hour of unveiling a plaque to the war dead in London's Liverpool Street station, Henry Wilson was assassinated outside his home in London.
The burning of the house in 1922 came in the aftermath of the assassination of Henry Hughes Wilson in London. Although it's not known who was responsible for burning the house, there is a sense that these were impulsive local actors who were trying to ensure the family never returned, and the estate would then be divided up by the Land Commission, which would benefit the locals. It could also have been a way of registering displeasure at Sean McKeown's tolerance of local Protestant families. So Sean McKeown was quite practical, pragmatic. He was not interested in destruction for the symbolic value of destruction. He wasn't interested in burning Currygran as an emblem of some kind. The family was quite well liked in the neighbourhood, in the area. The Wilsons had established a Church of Ireland school in the village of Bannalee. They'd established a cottage industry for young women doing crochet and embroidery, and that enabled some young women to save money for emigration or dowry. So they were a proactive family. They tried their best for the community. They were not disliked. But burning the house ensured they'd never come back.
Longford had only one house burnt during the Civil War, well below the rate for the rest of the country. Maybe in a small county there were simply fewer big houses. Or maybe it was the fact that the estates were smaller here than elsewhere, which allowed for a more intimate relation between the owners and the community.
In order to understand the Irish Revolution in all its complexities and so on, you have to understand how it unfolds in the decades after. 1923, the government introduced a number of very important pieces of legislation. Under the 1923 Land Act that's introduced by the government, that's intended to complete the transfer of land ownership from landlords to tenants, and also to redistribute land that is compulsorily acquired from the old landed elite to small uneconomic holders and so on in the area. There are certain clauses that protect big houses or big house families who continue to give a lot of employment in the area. So that effectively means that the government is recognising that these houses, or some of these houses, continue to be vitally important to the local economy, and that if you take the land from them, then actually more families are going to suffer than would actually benefit from the redistribution of the estates. And then it also introduces at the same time legislation that is aimed at basically putting down criminality. From the 1920s through to the 1970s, economics are at least as detrimental to the big house, if not far more so, than arsonists were in the 1919 to 1923 period. There's also the rise in taxation and rates.
But I don't know if my grandfather bought 400 acres. I don't know. But I think it was quite a big farm, and he bought it as a business, and that the rates was the final straw that made them decide to sell up. My mother believes the Land Commission bought the land. She also remembered a 3-day auction going on in Foxhall before they left, and she loved it. She was so excited, all of these people coming into the house and walking around, and she thought it was wonderful, and her father was really upset, and she couldn't understand why he was so sad. But in that auction, everything that could be sold was sold. So the fireplaces, the chandeliers, and many of the people who came to the house over those 3 days were agents for people living perhaps in Ireland, but mainly in America, England. And so parts of that house, she thought, went around the world. And then, unfortunately, the house was knocked after my family left.
The Land Commission knocked Whitehill in 1961, and the land was redistributed to existing tenants.
48 acres here of good land and 2 acres of forestry. That's the forest there, it starts there. It goes right round in a circle. Just 2 acres of that. And 48 acres of arable land. That's what we were allotted here with the Land Commission.
The revolutionary period affected more than Anglo-Irish relations. It also affected the stability of social position and the expectation of deference based on birth, class and religion. Women, both above and below stairs, experienced the possibility of different roles in post-war Britain and Ireland. But the equality emphasised in the 1916 Declaration of the Irish Republic, with its opening salutation, Irish men and Irish women, was not a priority for the men who took over running the country after 1922.
I think for many Irish women, the period of the First World War and the period that came immediately afterwards with the War of Independence until the end of the Civil War and the stability of the Irish Free State. They had freedom of movement, freedom of roles. Many of the women who took part in Cumann na mBan were well educated. They were interested in female suffrage. They were interested in having a role to play in the political life of the new state. But what happened very quickly after the Free State was established was that women were forced back into their more traditional roles. The Irish men who formed the administration of the new Irish Free State were quite conservative in their outlook, and they were deeply influenced by the attitude of the Catholic Church. And by the end of the 1930s, Eamon de Valera had enshrined that into the actual constitution, which was that the woman's place was in the home as wife and mother. Regrettably, from a 21st century point of view, that's still within our constitution.
And it's really difficult for the post-revolutionary state to live up to the expectations of that utopia. And that's especially true in Ireland, where you have a settlement which divides the independence movement into pro and anti-treaty factions. So you have a situation where many individuals are disillusioned and disheartened after 1923. And of course, the new state as well was established in a very difficult economic context in which the Civil War had burdened the new state with a huge debt and had seen infrastructure destroyed across the country. And you also had depressed post-war conditions globally, essentially. So you had a very difficult economic context for the new state to be established in.
The impact of this was the wage slump. As Pete Donnelly remembers, his family's wages were slashed in half as the economy of the big houses disappeared.
Well, I suppose that one part at that time, I suppose wages and employment didn't improve, because going away from Foxhall, my father and his mother worked with a farmer at corn, a shilling between them a day, 6 months apiece. Yeah.
By the end of the 20th century, only 2 Longford houses remained in the ownership of their original families, Castleforbes and Carriglass. The Lefroys sold Carriglass in 2005, thus ending a connection with the county reaching back to the 1830s.
But it was very interesting. It was 30 years hard labour, but I think by the time we left it, it was in very good shape, and we were broke, but it was in very good shape. Probably could turn into a very elegant ruin, actually, as Victorian Gothic sometimes does. You know, I can't see it really ever being used again, but it might be, I don't know.
Certainly true to say that in the last 30 years or so, public and political attitudes towards the country house has changed greatly in Ireland. Now, arguably one of the reasons for that is education. But there's also a realisation amongst people that in fact the vast majority of people living in rural Ireland were attached to the estates upon which these houses were centred.
I always thought of myself as Irish, and I still do.
But I wouldn't like to live anywhere else but Ireland.
I feel the same as my father. I mean, there's no country in which I wouldn't be happy because I'm interested in the local history and all that. But as far as the quality of life goes, I find myself simply more at home here. I know it and I love it.
I think there's still a complexity in how the country, or the people of the country, view the big houses. Maybe a mellowed complexity. I think they're still regarded as the houses of the landlords, and in some ways of artefacts of, you know, oppression or artefacts of rich and poor of that time. But I also think there is a great respect for those artefacts and a general recognition, maybe, or maybe it's just me, that they're Irish, even if it came through a convoluted historical route from one type of Ireland to another, and we're still on that journey.